Right. Welcome back. Today we are talking about 13, death, and I want you to notice two things about this card. The first is the dismembered pieces of a person or people that are on the ground or perhaps growing out of the ground, and also the fact that there is no name on this card. And we'll get to both of those in a second. But first, generally, Sallie Nichols wants us to think of this card as fear and transformation. How overcoming or confronting our fears changes our perspective of the world. And I think that that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it is a simple and foundational way for us to better understand our world and ourselves. That taking the time, the effort, and the energy to consciously connect with something that repulses us, or that causes us to feel afraid, or that we simply don't understand, is a way for us to reflect on who we are, what the world actually is, and to help us move a little out of our comfort zone so that we can see the world and ourselves from a new, more understanding perspective. And I think, again, that that's very difficult, but it is such a beautiful and necessary thing for us to do. But let's talk about the two things that I want you to notice. First is all of the pieces of people. Sallie Nichols talks in this chapter about how she thinks that those are the metaphorical pieces of self from the sacrifice of the hanged man, that the figure there tore themselves apart, metaphorically, and essentially took the individual pieces that made them, and essentially just threw them at death to be assessed. And if they were deemed good, then death would nurture them and help them grow and create a better, purer sense of self. And all of the stuff that was rejected would simply be tossed away, claimed by death, and taken away. And the way that she starts to describe this is really interesting to me. She says, whatever parts of the old order that are still vital and useful will be incorporated into the new, which immediately made me think of Enlightenment era thought and a very memorable conversation or discussion I had during my first year of college, which was about how Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was Mary Shelley's savage takedown of Enlightenment thought. That the fatal flaw of Enlightenment thinking was that you can simply chop away the parts of a philosophy, of a science, religion, of a society, separating the good from the bad and recreating the perfect, regardless of the context surrounding the individual parts. Spoiler alert, you can't just make the perfect thing by ignoring or simply dismissing the harmful parts of an ideology or system. And this, I think, really grounds death in the idea of critical thought, which is wild but really cool. And the issue, I think, is that Enlightenment era thought did help us focus on critically thinking about things, but only in one way, when we, in a more modern society, understand that there are two necessary steps rather than just one. Generally, when we want to critically think about something, it is important for us to take it as a whole, take out the individual parts, and analyze those, whether it's an argument or an idea or a book, a song, some sort of entertainment, some thing that will give you knowledge, or a person. We want to understand the individual parts and analyze those. The other thing that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't do such a good job of was to take those individual parts and critically think about how they work together as a whole, how the thing in its entirety works, and what the relationships between those individual pieces are. What's the context around them? And that, I think, is our step up that has brought us to a higher circle of thinking, essentially, is being able to not only analyze the individual pieces, but analyze how those work together or don't work together, so that we don't just take individual parts, stitch them together, and say, this is perfect. And then very quickly realize that the idea, book, song, person, whatever, is not perfect. And the last thing is talking about why there is no name on this card. This goes back to what I believe is a global phenomenon. There we go. Which is that old civilizations would very strongly believe that using a name was calling to it, essentially, that names had power, and if we said them or wrote them down, that doing that would bring the entity connected to that name to us. And so people didn't want to put down or say death because they were afraid that that would cause the entity to come to us, to kill them or remove something necessary from their life, whether it's crops, animals, friends, loved ones, their body, whatever. And Sallie Nichols, in the last few pages of this book, not in this book, of this chapter, yikes, in the chapter, talks about how in the 1980s we have moved past that, and we are not afraid to talk about death in more concrete terms and to use the term. One of the things that she says in here very specifically is like no longer trying to sugarcoat what's going on with somebody who is in a terminal state, talking directly to the families and not trying to like hedge around the idea. What I have noticed is that I think there has been a very significant cultural shift in the approach to talking about death in the younger generations, which hurt me to write and hurt me to say out loud again. But I wrote this as an annotation about this idea. There we go. How do we confront something that terrifies us and yet inspires so much thought, action, and art? There does seem to be a marked difference in the approach and reception of death between this older generation, accepted as normal in 1980, compared to how modern youth confront and conceptualize death. I do not think this changes the fear inherent for most, but it does mean that we are generally no longer afraid to call out to death or about death, and folks try to mitigate their emotional reactions through absurdist jokes and nihilistic detachment. Is this perhaps a symptom of the trained neglect of the holistic self and the dissolution of so many's faith in religion? Sallie Nichols, along with talking about how it is normal to talk about death, also says that perhaps death is a representation of a sort of a cleansing of the soul, and that since the industrial era, we have been so far removed from a more natural and clear understanding of what it means to be human, because our industrial systems have set us up to essentially just become productive entities, not even necessarily humans. I have a whole diatribe to go on about that. I won't do it here. But that question at the end is that perhaps doing this, taking the time, sacrificing the comfort of our understood reality and looking into who we are as people and what is actually driving us to do the things that we do, will help us reconnect with that understanding. And perhaps that is also a reason why so many younger people are moving away from organized religion, in the sense that our older generations don't understand, because the religion doesn't have the same draw, because it is the basis for so many of our productive harms. If that makes any sense. I'm not sure it does. But that's everything that I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, love you, bye!